There is a specific kind of sentence that keeps appearing in the private journals of men who sailed to Antarctica in the 1800s. Not in the published accounts, not in the official logs filed with naval departments and archived in government buildings. In the private ones, the letters written to brothers, the personal diaries that were never meant to be read by anyone with authority over anything. These sentences share a particular structure. They begin as descriptions, observations of geology, of coastline, of exposed rock where the wind had scoured the ice back far enough to reveal the surface beneath. They begin confidently, the way experienced naval officers write when they are cataloging what they see, and then they stop. Not at the end of a thought, not because the writer moved on to a different subject. They stop in the middle. The sentence starts and does not finish. Sometimes there is a dash. Sometimes the next line is about the weather, or the provisions, or the condition of the rigging, as if the writer simply decided mid-observation to talk about something else entirely. This happened once, and you would call it distraction. Twice, and you might call it coincidence. But the deeper I went into the recovered correspondence of men who participated in the great Antarctic expeditions of the 1840s, the more of these sentences I found. Different men, different nationalities, different expeditions, sailing under different flags, in some cases under flags that were actively hostile to one another. All of them starting the same kind of sentence, none of them finishing it. That is where this investigation begins. Let me tell you what the official history gives us, because the official history is not nothing. It is real, documented, and in many respects genuinely remarkable. 3 major expeditions reached Antarctic waters within a few years of each other. The American expedition, led by Charles Wilkes, departed in 1838. The French expedition, led by Jules Dumont d'Urville, departed in 1837. The British expedition, led by James Clark Ross, departed in 1839. These were serious undertakings. Naval vessels, scientific personnel, instruments calibrated to the finest standards of their era. These men were not adventurers in the romantic sense. They were officers of empire, accountable to admiralties and ministries, required to file precise reports and return with verifiable data. The official record they produced is substantial, coastlines charted, specimens collected, meteorological observations recorded with meticulous regularity. The history books treat these expeditions as landmarks of scientific exploration, and in the terms the history books use, they are right. That part is not in dispute. What is in dispute is what the official record left out, and the gap between what these expeditions actually encountered and what their governments chose to publish is not a small gap. It is not the kind of gap that accumulates through negligence or the ordinary imprecision of Victorian-era record-keeping. It is a gap with a shape, a specific shape, and the shape repeats across all 3 expeditions with a precision that the word coincidence cannot bear. Start with Wilkes. His published charts were disputed almost immediately, not by foreign rivals attempting to undermine American claims, but by his own officers. Men who had been on the same ships, seen the same coastlines, and returned with a different understanding of what those coastlines contained. Wilkes faced court-martial upon his return. He would face it again before his career ended. The charges shifted over time: illegal punishment of crew, conduct unbecoming, the procedural vocabulary of institutions that need a reason on paper without stating the real reason out loud. He spent the decades following his Antarctic voyage in a kind of bureaucratic dimness, his findings perpetually overshadowed, his personal journals substantially edited before they reached publication. The edits are not random. When researchers began comparing the published journals to the surviving manuscript versions in the 20th century, a pattern emerged in what had been removed. Not the navigational data, not the meteorological records, the geological descriptions. The passages about what the exposed rock looked like in the regions where Antarctic winds had pushed the ice back far enough to reveal the surface beneath. D'Urville returned from the south in 1840. He published his accounts. Adélie land was named, charted, and claimed for France, and D'Urville was celebrated in the way that men who plant flags in ice are celebrated. Then in May of 1842, he boarded a train at Versailles with his wife and son. The train derailed. The fire that followed killed all 3 of them. The expedition documents he had been traveling with, materials he was reportedly transporting for institutional review, were gone, not lost at sea, not destroyed in a warehouse, gone on a train in France, 2 years after he came home from the ice. I am not telling you what that means. I want to be precise about that. Train accidents happen. Tragedy is not evidence of anything except tragedy, but I ask you to hold that detail, hold it, and keep reading. Ross is the most difficult case because Ross was the most disciplined writer of the three. His published accounts are models of Victorian scientific restraint, precise, methodical, stripped of anything that might read as embellishment. He is remembered as the man who reached the shelf of ice that now bears his name, a wall hundreds of miles long and as tall as sea cliffs, something that stopped him absolutely and that he described in language of genuine awe contained within careful professional measure. The Ross Ice Shelf. It is real. It is still there. His published descriptions of it are accurate and have been confirmed by every subsequent expedition, but his crew logged separately. His officers filed accounts with the Admiralty independently, and those accounts, the raw ones, the ones that took researchers well into the 20th century to fully access, contain passages that do not appear anywhere in Ross's official narrative. References, made by multiple officers writing independently of one another, to what one of them described only as geometric anomalies in the exposed rock faces. References to stone in the scoured zones along the coastline that did not behave the way stone behaves, that did not break the way stone breaks. Those passages did not make it into the published record. They were not lost. They were filed. They were simply never included in the version of events that the public was given. This raises a simple but critical question. What kind of geological observation requires removal from a naval officer's official report? Cartographers of the Victorian era were not easily frightened. They were trained to record what they saw without editorial judgment. The job was documentation. The job was precision. If the rock looked unusual, you described how it looked unusual and you moved on. You did not omit it. Unless what you saw was not the kind of thing that fit into the framework of what you were supposed to be finding. But I want to stay with the private letters for a moment, because that is where the human cost of this becomes visible, and the human cost is something the official record has almost entirely erased. The rate of psychological distress among early Antarctic expedition crews is not widely discussed in mainstream historical literature. It is documented, but quietly. Multiple crew members from multiple expeditions were described in ship records as suffering from what the surgeons of the day called polar madness, a broad and flexible diagnosis that covered everything from simple cabin fever to episodes of acute hallucinatory crisis. Some of these men described visions of architecture in the ice, towers, walls, grids of stone. The rational response to that is well established. Extreme environments, hypoxia, isolation, the visual distortions caused by Antarctic light, the Fata Morgana effect in which distant ice takes on the appearance of structures. All of that is real. All of that is documented. I am not dismissing it, but here is the detail that the rational response cannot account for. The visions were not random. They were not generic European castles transposed onto foreign ice. The descriptions that survived in private correspondence had a specific and recurring character, massive scale, non-European proportion, stone rather than timber or brick, layouts suggesting not individual buildings but planned arrangements, grids, as if whatever these men were experiencing, whether through hallucination or through something else entirely, was organized, was deliberate, was the visible fragment of something much larger still concealed beneath the surface. One officer, whose family donated his private letters to a regional archive in 1974, wrote to his brother describing a sequence of walls extending along a cliff face for a distance he could not estimate, bearing no resemblance to any formation he was able to attribute to nature or weather. He wrote that he had reported it to his commanding officer. He wrote that he was told to strike it from his personal log. He wrote that he did not strike it from the letter. That letter was cited in exactly one academic paper. The journal that published that paper folded 2 years later. The paper was never republished. Now, I want to tell you about a man named Karsten Borchgrevink. He was a Norwegian-British explorer and part of a whaling expedition that, in 1895, became by most accounts the first group to actually land on the Antarctic continent, not chart it from a distance, not approach and retreat. Stand on it, walk in on it. He returned in 1898 with a dedicated scientific expedition and spent the winter of 1899 on the continent. The first humans to deliberately overwinter in Antarctica. The official record of what he found narrows in a way I have come to recognize. It becomes very specific about certain things: the cold, the isolation, the meteorological measurements, the biological samples collected by his crew, and it becomes very vague, almost deliberately vague, about others. The interior geology, the character of the exposed rock in the scoured zones, the formations. One of his crew, a zoologist named Nikolai Hansen, died during the expedition. He was 29 years old. Official cause: a digestive condition. He receives one paragraph in most historical accounts. Another crew member returned from the expedition and spent the remainder of his life declining to speak publicly about what he had experienced. He gave one interview to a Norwegian newspaper in 1903. The section of that interview describing his time on the continent was not translated into English for nearly 60 years. When it finally was, it described crew members experiencing what the interviewer carefully called episodes of geographic fixation. Crew members who became convinced they could see something beneath the ice, something organized, something that should not have been there. In Borsch Gravink's own private correspondence, there is a pattern in his language that I find impossible to dismiss once you have seen it. He is precise about logistics. He is careful and detailed about wildlife. He becomes strangely abstract, almost evasive, when describing the interior geology, when describing what the rock looked like, where the wind had done its work. He begins those descriptions and does not complete them, not metaphorically, literally. In at least 3 known passages from his private letters, the sentence about the rock formations is either cut short or transitions abruptly to a different subject, or exists in a version that differs markedly from the version he filed with his expedition sponsors. The same sentence. Started, not finished, again. This is where the pattern becomes impossible to brush aside, because what I have described so far could still be explained, with effort, as isolated incidents, individual suppressions, individual breakdowns. The ordinary friction between what explorers experience and what institutions permit them to publish. One government redacting one explorer's findings is bureaucracy. It is caution. It is the ordinary machinery of empire managing information that might be complicated to explain. But 3 governments doing it, 3 governments with no coordinated communication, 3 governments whose nations were actively competing for territorial claims and scientific prestige, all redacting the same category of information, all suppressing the same type of observation, all leaving the same shaped absence in the official record within the same compressed window of time. That is not bureaucracy. That is architecture. That is a structure so consistent across institutions that should have had every incentive to diverge that the consistency itself becomes the evidence. The official explanation collapses here. For the natural geology plus overexcited explorers' explanation to fully account for what we find in these records, you need to explain why. 3 separate governments all independently chose to remove descriptions of rock formations from expedition reports while leaving everything else intact. The temperature readings remain. The navigational charts remain. The biological specimens are cataloged with perfect thoroughness. Just the rocks. Just the descriptions of what the exposed surface of the continent looked like where the ice had pulled back far enough to see it. 3 nations, no shared communication, all suppressing the same thing. The probability of that being coincidence does not merely strain, it collapses entirely. And here is where something much older enters the picture. Because the 1840s expeditions were not the first record of Antarctic knowledge. They were not the first documentation of that coastline. There are maps, produced centuries before any of these men set sail, that depict Antarctic geography with a specificity that should have been impossible. The Piri Reis map. The Orontius Phineus map. Pre-colonial cartographic documents that show the Antarctic coastline, not as it appears today, locked under miles of accumulated ice, but as it would appear without that ice. The sub-glacial topography. The actual surface of the continent beneath the sheet that covers it. Coastlines that match features only confirmed by 20th century sonar mapping, confirmed by technology that did not exist when those maps were drawn. The standard explanation for this is that these maps were copied from older sources, compiled from the records of explorers whose documents have since been lost. And I want you to sit with what that explanation actually admits. It admits that someone was in Antarctica before the expeditions we recognize as first contact. It admits that someone had been there in sufficient detail to produce cartographic records accurate enough that European mapmakers centuries later could reproduce them with recognizable precision. It just does not ask who. It files the question under prior sources and moves on, as if prior sources is an answer and not another door. What was prior to the prior sources? What civilization produced the original maps that European cartographers were copying? What level of organizational capacity does it require to be present in Antarctica, to chart its coastline in detail, to leave records specific enough to survive centuries of transmission and still accurately represent subglacial features? That is not an individual. That is not a single voyage of discovery. That is institutional knowledge. That is a civilization operating at a scale we have no official name for and no officially sanctioned history of. And here is where 1840 stops being a story about Antarctica and starts being a story about everything else. Because 1840 does not sit in isolation in the historical record. It sits at the center of a cluster. It is the decade in which Tartaria, a territory that had appeared on European maps for centuries, designating a vast organized presence across the interior of Asia, began its final disappearance from the cartographic record. It is the decade that immediately precedes the period in which massive buildings began appearing across the globe, with no adequate construction documentation, no verifiable supply chains, no adequate explanation for how they were built so quickly and at such uniform scale. It is the decade in which the systematic standardization of historical narrative across competing nations was accelerating toward the version of the past we now inherit as settled fact. 3 expeditions sailed to Antarctica in the same decade that a civilization was disappearing from maps. 3 expeditions whose geological observations were suppressed by 3 governments with no reason to cooperate. 3 expeditions whose crew members came back broken, silent, or writing sentences they could not bring themselves to finish. The pattern repeats with an unsettling precision that individual explanations cannot absorb. Not the geology alone, not the simultaneous expeditions alone, not the suppressed reports alone, not the deaths and the silence and the unfinished sentences alone. All of it together, pointing in the same direction, across languages and archives and institutional memories that had every reason to disagree and somehow did not. What I keep returning to is the simplest element, not the ice shelf, not the pre-colonial maps, not even the coordinated suppression across 3 competing governments. I keep returning to those sentences, the ones that start and do not end, because a redaction from an official report is an institutional act. Someone with authority made a decision and removed something. That is a choice made by power, but a sentence that stops in the middle of a private letter in a document no superior officer was ever meant to read. That is a different kind of silence. That is a man deciding, alone, in his own handwriting, in his own words, that whatever he was about to write should not be written, not because someone told him, because he looked at what he was about to describe and decided it was better left unfinished. What do you see that makes you stop writing in your own private letter? What do you see that makes you put down the pen in the middle of the sentence and write about the weather instead? What did the rock look like in those exposed margins where the wind had done its slow work, that was more bearable to leave undescribed than to commit to paper? That question does not have a comfortable answer, and I think the people who designed our official understanding of that period knew it did not. I think that is precisely why the comfortable answers were built so carefully around it, so that the question itself would eventually stop being asked. But the unfinished sentences are still there, in the archives, in the letters that made it to descendants who donated them to collections that nobody prominent enough to matter has ever systematically read. The sentence starts. It does not end. And in the space where the ending should be, if you are willing to sit with it long enough, something waits. Not an answer, something older than an answer, the shape of a truth that 3 competing nations, and every official history written since, have spent nearly 2 centuries learning not to see.